Chapter 23 of The Sealed Message by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 23. Todd's Discovery. On returning to the Silbury Hotel, Gerald sat down to think over the important conversation with Reb. To all appearances the master was as innocent as the man. Nevertheless, according to the Major, Geary had been to the Pixie's house on the fatal night in spite of his denial. On the face of it, the negro had no reason to kill Belaria, and Reb had sworn that the murder was neither committed nor prompted by him. If this were so, it appeared strange that Reb should have found Geary not only in the grounds of the Pixie's house but in the mansion itself when he arrived. Seeing that Geary was thus first in the field, it was not improbable that he had caught a glimpse of the assassin. Whether he had told his master it was of course impossible to say. But Haskins determined to have another interview with the landlord of the Devon maid, and force him to disclose the whole truth, which he assuredly had not told in his wife's presence. One important thing Gerald had learned from Reb, and that was the truth of his surmise regarding Charity. She was, as he had always supposed, the twin sister of Mavis, and Haskins congratulated himself on guessing this before Reb had spoken out. Still, it was just as well that rage had made the Major thus candid, and the matter was put beyond all doubt. Haskins was pleased also by the discovery, as, guided by him, Mavis would be quite willing to divide the income, and then Lady Euphemia would not be angry at Todd's runaway marriage. So far, everything was right. But the mystery of the crime had still to be solved. Until it was, Mavis must continue not only to be an outcast and a fugitive from justice, but must remain unable to claim her rights as Julian Durham's heiress. Apparently, Geary and Reb and Signor Venosta, as an emissary of the Tana Society, were all innocent. If so, who was the guilty person? Gerald wondered if the letter to which Mavis had referred could be found, as he firmly believed that it would afford a clue to the identity of the criminal. In his own mind he constructed the manner in which the crime had been committed. Belaria had received this mysterious letter, which for some reason overcame her fears sufficiently to make her venture out at night. To meet the writer of the letter she had opened the gates, and then had been stabbed by her own knife, Geary's weapon, which had been wrested from her in a hand-to-hand struggle. The wonder was that the struggle had not attracted attention. As it was, Reb swore that he had heard only one scream, and that might have been uttered by Mavis when she found the dead body of the nurse. Belaria, therefore, was in all probability slain unawares. However, it was useless to build up theories which were all moonshine, so Gerald resolved to wait until Todd and Arnold arrived. According to McAndrew's letter, they would come to Silbury early next day, so Gerald had a good many hours to himself. He had half a mind to see Inspector Morgan and learn all details concerning the inquest, as some possible evidence might have been obtained likely to throw light on the darkness. But Haskins refrained from doing so, as he did not wish to arouse Morgan's suspicions and reopen the case. For Mavis's sake, the quieter he moved in the matter the better it would be. Gerald wondered, after hearing Reb's acknowledgment of Charity's birth, if he had any idea of the scheme by which the girls had been made to change places. But after reflection he decided that it was impossible, as Mrs. Pelham had managed very cleverly. Also, Reb was unaware that the twin he had got rid of was now Mrs. McAndrew, and, since that young lady was at Amsterdam, there would be no chance of her being met by Mrs. Birch and her daughter when in Switzerland. Bearing in mind what Mrs. Crosby had told him of her projected tour abroad, Gerald was greatly surprised when he met the widow and her mother driving up the Silbury High Street from the railway station. She saw him at once, as he stood thunderstruck on the pavement, and beckoned for him to come to the side of the landau. "You are surprised to see us here," she said with a gay smile. "This is not Switzerland, is it?" "You said nothing about coming down here yesterday," he answered. "No, because neither I nor my mother had any intention of coming. It was this way, Gerald. Michael, Major Reb, you know, came in almost as soon as you had left, and we told him all that had taken place." "Why did you do that?" asked Haskins imperatively. "Don't bully, Gerald," said Mrs. Crosby tartly. "I told Michael because I have no secrets from Michael, and he was very angry that you should have spoken to me as you did." "I was perfectly polite, permit me to remind you, Madge." "Don't call me by my Christian name," she said as usual. "Well then, Michael went away to have an explanation with you, and later telegraphed to me that you had gone to Devonshire and that he intended to follow at once. He also asked us to come down that we might see the Pixies' house, as we intend to repair it when we marry." "Do you indeed?" muttered Haskins, ironically. "Of course," said Mrs. Crosby, with an airy flutter of her laces. "And I may tell you, Gerald, that I came down the more willingly since I do not want you and Michael to quarrel. That is why we are here." "To see the house and to prevent a quarrel," said Gerald, coolly. "I am greatly obliged to you for the trouble you have taken, Mrs. Crosby, but I have already seen the Major." Mrs. Birch, who had hitherto kept silence, looked up sharply. "Have you had a quarrel?" she demanded eagerly. "Yes and no. Reb was slightly difficult to deal with, but we now understand one another." Mrs. Crosby asked, "What about?" "About various things," answered Haskins, carelessly. He was determined not to answer her questions, as he had a vague idea that she was not so honestly his friend as she pretended to be. "And you parted amiably, I hope?" said Mrs. Birch. Haskins laughed as he remembered the parting, and how he had locked Reb in the room. "I think that the Major would gladly see me tarred and feathered," he said lightly. "There!" cried Mrs. Crosby, with a childish pout. "I knew you had quarreled, and I did so wish you to be friends. I want you to come to the Pixies' house when I marry Michael and see the improvements. I have already arranged what to do." "Have you been down here before, then?" asked Gerald, astonished. "Yes, over 2 years ago. Michael asked me down when we were first engaged. I saw that poor Valeria, but not Mavis." "Why did you not see Mavis?" "Because Michael said her mental state was so sad that she might be dangerous. She was shut up on the day I went over the house, and as I was only there for an hour she knew nothing of my visit. I and Mother were stopping in the neighborhood. It was when I was learning to drive a motor, Gerald. I would have taken that poor girl out for drives, as I got to know the country so thoroughly, but it was too dangerous." "Where did you stop?" asked Gerald, still lingering, although Mrs. Birch seemed inclined to cut short her daughter's chatter. "At a village miles away called Beldown. Why do you start?" "A mosquito stung me," answered Haskins readily. But his real reason for starting was that Beldown happened to be the place where Mr. Arnold and Todd were now stationed. "There are heaps of mosquitoes here, Mrs. Crosby. You will be stung." "Ah, well, we are only here for a couple of days, at the Pixies' house, that is. I merely want to look round, and now that the poor mad girl has gone I can explore at my leisure. Good day. I wish I could ask you to come over, but Michael might object. So stupid of you to quarrel with my future husband when we are such friends." She gave the signal to the driver of the landau to move on, and both she and her mother bestowed friendly smiles on the young man as he took off his hat. Gerald watched the carriage climb up the long street and vanish over the crest of the hill. Then he walked back again to the hotel, wondering why Mrs. Crosby was so anxious to retain his friendship when she became Mrs. Rebb. He knew that Madge was a flighty woman, although much cleverer than she pretended to be, and was sure that she had some reason for all this friendliness and chatter. However, he had more important things to think about than Mrs. Crosby's airs and graces, and spent a wakeful night building up theories and knocking them down again. By dawn he had arrived at the conclusion that Geary was the criminal. "I expect," thought Haskins while taking his bath, "that Geary found his hold over Reb was getting lax, so he deliberately killed Valeria, knowing that the Major had gone to the Pixies' house, in the hope of getting blackmail by threatening to throw the blame of the murder on his master. And by the murder he secured to Reb an income out of which large sums could be paid. Yes, I really believe that Geary will prove to be the guilty person. But how am I to fix the crime on him?" This was a hard question to answer, and Gerald waited for the arrival of Todd to put it to him, since 2 heads are better than 1. The solicitor arrived at midday along with Arnold, having come from Beldown, so they explained, by railway. Todd looked anxious, and not so healthy as he had done in London, but Haskins put this down to the man's unavoidable fretting after his bride. Arnold had not changed in the least, and appeared to be as tiny and gnome-like as ever. First and foremost the 2 men, being hungry, had dinner, and then Gerald conducted them both to the hotel drawing room, a gorgeous apartment which had been placed at his disposal by Mrs. Jennings for an extra £1 on the bill. Having the apartment to themselves, the three men saw that the door was closed, and then sat down to talk. Gerald immediately asked the question which had been trembling on his tongue from the moment he set eyes on his friend. "In the first place, Todd," he said impatiently, "what took you and Arnold to Beldown?" "That is a long story," said Todd leisurely. "Then tell it as shortly as you can." "One moment. Let us do things in order. First, let me know your doings here, Jerry." "But," began Haskins with irritation. Todd cut him short. "See here, Jerry," said he firmly, "I am supposed to be your solicitor, and it is my place to conduct the business. I want things done in order. First your story, and then mine. Both will be extremely interesting, I have no doubt." Gerald stared. "Why should you think I have anything to tell?" "Well," observed McAndrew jocularly, "a little bird, Mrs. Jennings by name, whispered to me that 2 London ladies had come down on a visit to Major Rebb, who is camping, so to speak, at the Pixies' house." "Yes, Mrs. Crosby and her mother. What of that?" "I shall tell you when I have heard what you have to say about them." Arnold uttered a grunt and raked his long beard with lean fingers. Haskins looked from one to the other, quite mystified. "Has what you have to say anything to do with those ladies?" "A great deal to do with them, Jerry." A light broke in on Haskins' clouded brain. "Mrs. Crosby said that she had stopped at Beldown. That is where you have been." "Hum," said Todd, glancing at Arnold. "I didn't think she would have admitted so much." "Todd," Gerald caught his friend's arm, "don't worry me with your hints and looks. Has Mrs. Crosby anything to do with this crime?" "I can't say," rejoined the solicitor stolidly, "and I shan't speak until you tell me how you got along with Rebb." Haskins threw himself back in his chair and made the best of a Scotsman's obstinacy. "I have something very important indeed to tell you," he said seriously. "You know the likeness between the girls?" McAndrew nodded. "I told Mr. Arnold here all about it, and about your idea of the 2 being twins. My idea has proved to be correct. They are twins." Todd jumped up, scattering his papers, and with his red hair almost standing on end. "Do you mean to say that Rebb—" "Yes. Sit down, Toddy, and listen," said Gerald vigorously, and when his legal adviser became quiet, he related the whole of the conversation with Rebb. "Well, I'm blessed," muttered Todd, rubbing his head, when the narrative was ended. "What a wonderful thing! There is something in your intuitions after all, Jerry." "I don't think it needed much intuition to guess at a possible relationship, seeing how marvelously alike Mavis is to Charity. The wonderful part consists in my getting Rebb to give himself away." "Ah," said Arnold significantly. "The military gentleman is beginning to see that the wheel of fortune is turning the wrong way with him." "And quite right, too," said Todd meditatively. "What a scoundrel the man is, to be sure. Well, Jerry, important as what you have told us is, I am more interested in the movements of Mrs. Crosby and her mother. When you tell me about them I can explain what Mr. Arnold and myself have discovered at Beldown." "There is little to tell about them. Rebb came down after me, and they came down after Rebb. He asked his future bride here to have a second look at her future home." "Oh, so she had been here before?" "Yes, so she says, some time ago. This is her second visit." "Her third, more like," muttered Arnold in his beard. "We can't be sure of that," said Todd rapidly. "For heaven's sake, tell me what you mean," cried Haskins, jumping up in his turn. "My nerves are wearing thin with all this suspense." "Well, then," began McAndrew, shuffling with his papers, "it's this way. Mr. Arnold here was going about the country in his caravan, selling books, and reached Beldown on the same day that Mavis fled. Mavis fled at night." "Well, well," cried McAndrew testily, "you know what I mean. Arnold was at Beldown on the day of the night when Mavis fled, and the murder was committed. Is that plain enough?" "Yes, go on, Toddy. Don't be a silly ass." "I am your solicitor just now, and not your pal," said Todd with great dignity. "Well, then, while wandering about Beldown, Arnold saw 2 ladies in a motor car. One was driving, and one was being driven." "And they were?" Mrs. Birch and her daughter, whom we, Jerry, supposed to be at Bognor. I never knew that Mrs. Crosby could drive a motor. Oh, yes. I taught her a trifle myself, and she is quite an expert at the business. She mentioned to-day when I stood by her carriage how she had motored over every inch of the country. But what was she doing down hereabouts when she was supposed to be at Bognor? That is what I want to ask her, and I'm glad that she is on the spot." Gerald thought for a few moments. "How did you recognize these ladies, Mr. Arnold?" "Major Rebb once showed me a colored photograph of the lady to whom he was engaged, and I recognized Mrs. Crosby when she passed in her motor. A severe-looking old lady in black was with her, and Mr. McAndrew tells me that she is Mrs. Birch, the mother. I may tell you that the two ladies wore motor goggles and veils." "Then how did you recognize them?" asked Gerald again. "Mrs. Crosby's veil was up as they passed, and she pulled it down when she saw that I was looking earnestly at her. The motor was going very slowly at the moment, because a hay wain was in front blocking the road." "I see. Well, what happened?" "The motor went to the inn at Beldown. It was about 6:00, and the two ladies had dinner. They were at the inn when I left Beldown in my caravan, on the way to Leagarth, where I hoped to rescue Mavis." "Yes, yes, yes," cried Todd, impatient at the slow way in which Arnold was speaking. "And late that night, about 10:00, he passed the motor on the road between Beldown and Leagarth. It had broken down, and Mrs. Crosby was tinkering with the machine." "I shouldn't think she could mend a broken motor, Todd." "Oh, I don't expect anything very serious was the matter. Probably her driving she drives furiously, as a woman always does had put the gear out of order. However, Arnold passed them and camped some distance outside Leagarth, so that the villagers who knew his face would not recognize him. Then, some time after 11, he saw the motor coming along, also skirting the village. The two women were in it, and he thought that they had lost their way. And then again he fancied that Mrs. Crosby was going to the Devon Maid to see Rebb. At all events, the motor passed out of sight in the darkness. I may tell you that its lamps were not lighted, so Mrs. Crosby ran the risk of police interference. Rather foolish, I think, seeing she did not want to be seen." "Well, well," said Gerald after a pause. "And what does all this mean?" "Arnold," went on Todd cautiously, "did not attach much importance to this motor car business, but when he told me I fancied that Mrs. Crosby had to do with the murder." "I don't see how." "I do. She didn't want to be recognized. She had no lamps, so that she could slip along easily, and, as we learned at Beldown, she did not return through the village. If she did not come down to murder Bellaria, why was she in this neighborhood, and why did she lie to you about Bognor? It's a mare's nest you have found, Todd. Mrs. Crosby has no motive to murder Bellaria, and she certainly hasn't the nerve." "I'll ask her myself," said Todd, rising. "Come on over to Leagarth." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Sealed Message by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 24. The Second Marriage. In his anxiety to prove his theory, Todd would then and there have taken his friend and Arnold over to the Pixie's house. But Gerald, more cool-headed than the impetuous Scotsman, pointed out that he had not sufficient grounds upon which to accuse the widow. "If you ask her to explain her movements on that night, she will only refuse to gratify your curiosity," said Haskins positively. "The police could make her speak." "The police could not arrest her without a warrant, and there is not, to my mind, sufficient evidence to obtain a warrant. And certainly the police cannot ask questions about anyone's private affairs until some reason can be given to show why such questions should be asked." "Those ladies said that they were at Bognor when they really intended to come to Devonshire," observed Arnold, who seemed to side entirely with McAndrew. "It is a woman's privilege to change her mind, Mr. Arnold. And I ask you, what possible motive could Mrs. Crosby have had to journey all the way to Devonshire to commit an unnecessary murder?" "Unnecessary?" snorted Todd, displeased. "Seeing that the murder is ascribed to Mavis, who may thus be shut up, to provide Rebb with an income, I cannot see that it is unnecessary." Ah, but Mrs. Crosby did not know that the Major's income depended upon the seclusion of Mavis," said Haskins rapidly. "I did not tell her, as there was no reason why I should. And I am quite certain that Reb himself would not explain. If Mrs. Crosby had known that his income was so uncertain she would have refused to marry him." "Perhaps she will do so now," said Arnold hopefully. "No. She has come down to see about the repairs to the Pixies' house," answered Gerald, "and Reb loves her too well to let her go. I believe, Todd, that Geary is the man who committed the murder." "It sounds plausible enough," grumbled McAndrew, "and a case could easily be built up against him. But the presence of Mrs. Crosby on the spot has to be explained." Gerald rose and walked up and down the room, thinking. "I tell you what, Todd," he said abruptly. "I am getting tired of poking about in the dark. I believe, as you do, and Arnold does, that Mavis is entirely innocent. Hitherto we have kept her in hiding, so as to prove her innocence, since she may be arrested if she is discovered. Well, then, I think it would be best to let her be arrested." Both Arnold and McAndrew jumped up wrathfully. "What!" they exclaimed, and Todd continued. "What is the use of charity's sacrifice if you intend to hand over Mavis to the law?" "Todd," said Gerald seriously, "as things stand now, we are not able to force either Geary or Mrs. Crosby or Reb to speak. If Mavis is put on her trial they can be called as witnesses, and then the truth may come out. Also, Mavis can be examined by 2 doctors. I shall insist upon that, when her sanity will certainly be proved beyond all doubt. If she is proved to be sane, then Reb will find himself in Queer Street, and will be hard put to it to prove his innocence." "We could have done all this in the first case," said Arnold irritably. "No," replied Haskins sharply, "for then we did not have the evidence to hand that we have now. Reb, Geary, and Mrs. Crosby are all implicated, and we may also be able to place Venosta in the witness box. But the proof that Mavis is responsible for her acts, and has been shut up in the Pixies' house, while Reb enjoyed her income, will gain the sympathy of everyone, and will go far to show her innocence. I shall support her throughout the case." "She is Reb's ward, and is under 21," said Todd crossly, "so the Major may not allow you to support her." "I propose to take her out of the Major's keeping by making her my wife forthwith," said Gerald coolly. "But if you do, sir," cried Arnold, much upset, "Mavis will be arrested. Indeed, I doubt if you will find any clergyman who will marry her to you, seeing that she is said to be a lunatic." "That's all right," rejoined Haskins easily. "I have arranged that in my own mind. There is an old college chum of my late father's who can see both sides of the question, and I can trust him utterly. To day I'm going to London to repeat your experience and get a special license, Toddy. Our marriages are expensive matters, old boy, aren't they?" Todd grunted and kicked the carpet. "When you are married, what do you intend to do?" "I shall bring my wife down here within 3 days, and we shall all go over to the Pixies' house. Mrs. Crosby will not have left by that time, as, from the quantity of luggage she brought, I fancy she intends to remain for a week or so. Then we can confront her and Reb, and if possible, Todd, I wish you to bring Geary on the scene. Thus all the actors in this tragedy of real life, as Mrs. Pelham Oden would call it, will be together, and we can bring about the fall of the curtain." "With Mrs. Gerald Haskins in jail," said Arnold gloomily. "Mavis will be arrested on Reb's information at once." "That is highly probable. But whether Mavis appears early or late she will have to stand her trial, seeing that she is accused. Also, she will have to be examined as to her sanity. But in both these ordeals I intend to be beside her as her husband." There was a pause. "Well?" "It's a forlorn hope," said McAndrew, hesitating, "and risky. Still—" He looked questioningly at Arnold. The little man nodded sadly. "Things are so bad that they can scarcely be worse," he remarked, "and certainly, as Mr. Haskins thinks, a public trial would force the witnesses we want into court. Once in the box and closely examined, the truth might come to light. I think Mr. Haskins should do as he says, but it is a risk." "Life is all risks," said Gerald cheerfully. "Well, I am going to pack up and clear off to London. And you, Toddy?" I shall keep my eye on Geary, and if possible I shall see Mrs. Crosby or her mother." Gerald nodded, and matters thus being arranged he went up to London that same afternoon, en route for Southend to make Mavis his wife. Todd and Arnold, left behind, remained at the Prince's Hotel, and wandered about the country even as far as Leagarth. They heard that the London ladies were still with the Major, but did not catch a glimpse of them. And even Todd, audacious as he was, shrank from going to the Pixies' house and openly accusing the lively widow. Todd took occasion to pay a special visit to the Devon maid, and found the hotel in charge of a rough man and his slatternly wife. It appeared that since Mrs. Geary's disappearance her husband had taken heavily to drink, and refused to attend to his business. His uncivilized instincts had got the better of him, and he was running wild in the neighborhood. Mrs. Geary, now with her mother in Barnstaple, refused to return to him, or to surrender her children, and Adonis talked loudly of forcing her stubborn will by law. But as yet he had not done anything, perhaps because he was in danger of the law himself. Todd learned as much from Inspector Morgan, whom he met at the Silbury High Street on the third day after Gerald's departure, in search of his wife. In the course of an idle conversation about this, that, and the other thing, for McAndrew, during his holiday at the Devon maid, had learned to know Morgan intimately, the name of the negro was mentioned, and the inspector uttered a grunt. "He's a black scoundrel, that," he remarked. "Why?" asked Todd, pricking up his ears. "I always understood that Geary was a meritorious inhabitant of Denley. He certainly conducted the Devon maid well, as I stopped there myself. You know that?" Morgan nodded. "Things have changed since you and Mr. Haskins were there, sir," he said slowly. "It was Mrs. Geary who kept the inn respectable, and a miserable life she had with that sooty blackguard. But she got fed up with his brutality and went back to her mother in Barnstaple. Since then the inn has gone from bad to worse, and Geary is drinking." "I heard something of this," observed Todd. "Why don't you pull him up?" "I am going to," said Morgan grimly. "I have my eye on him. He is nearly always drunk, and frightens children and insults women and threatens men. Sooner or later he will be locked up. And the strength the man has! Why, do you know, Mr. McAndrew, that he knocked down the river wall of the Pixies' house, that portion overhanging the pool? I wanted to run him in for that, but Major Rebb will not prosecute, for some reason." "He has a sneaking regard for his old servant, I suppose," said Todd, smiling. "But this wall, Morgan, how the dickens could one man knock it down?" "Oh, the wall has been in a shaky condition for years and years," said the inspector. "It was only held together by the ivy, the bricks and mortar were rotten. But even then a good strong push would have sent it over, and Geary gave it that push. He was climbing over, I believe, as he wanted, mad with drink, to get into the Pixies' house, and because of the ladies Major Rebb had ordered the gates to be closed and locked. However, he found that the wall leaned a trifle towards the cliff, and managed to knock it down. The man has an immense strength naturally, and when drink is added to that—" Morgan shrugged his big shoulders. "I have known drunken men to do some wonderful things in the way of superhuman strength," he finished. "I think Geary must have been superhuman to have pushed that wall over, rotten as it was. If you remember, Mr. Haskins climbed it." "I remember, and a good thing it was that it didn't fall and drop him into the pool below. However, it's down now, and on that side the grounds of the Pixies' house lie open to the world. By the way, how is Mr. Haskins? Has he got over the death of that crazy girl?" Todd laughed. "I don't think myself that she was crazy, Morgan, or that she killed that wretched Italian woman. Nor do I believe that she is dead," and he looked straightly at the officer's red face. "Have you any reason to think she is alive, sir?" "Her body has not been found," rejoined Todd evasively. "What of that? Plenty of bodies are not found. But the girl was never outside the Pixies' house before that time she fled after the murder. Not knowing the lie of the country, it is more than probable that she tumbled into some river or water hole and was drowned. If alive, she certainly would have been caught by now. We have had constables all over the place for weeks." "Even now?" "Well, no. The men have been withdrawn, as so long a time has elapsed since the commission of the crime. We'll hear no more of the matter." "Never prophesy until you know, Mr. Inspector." "I do know," said Morgan positively. "I don't go about with my eyes shut, Mr. McAndrew." And after saluting he stalked in a military way down the street, leaving Todd to pursue his shopping, which Todd had come out to do. McAndrew rather chuckled at the positive way in which this official Dogberry, who could see no further than his nose, asserted that the Pixies' House murder had been relegated to the past. On the 4th day of Gerald's absence Todd received a letter from his friend in the character of a bridegroom. Everything had gone well, as the clergyman, on hearing the whole story, told in Haskin's persuasive manner, had joined Mavis and his friend's son in holy matrimony. Now Reb had lost his income, as the conditions of the will had been fulfilled, and in spite of all his precautions Mavis had come into her own. Todd would have been less than human had he not reflected with great glee that, the income being safe from Reb's clutches, his wife, as the twin sister of Mavis, would benefit to the extent of $3,000 a year. "And Lady Euphemia called me a fool," chuckled Todd complacently. "What will she say when she knows that I have married an heiress, and will be able to get back a part of the family estate?" In his letter Gerald informed McAndrew with great pride that Mavis had learned how to sign her name, and had produced a singularly fine specimen of calligraphy. "The rest of my darling's education," wrote the young man, "will be completed by me after all these troubles are over, and we can spend a proper honeymoon." Education as a means of passing a honeymoon did not commend itself to Todd, and he made a grimace. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to Amsterdam, telling Charity to come over, and repair to Mrs. Pelham Oden's London flat, where he would join her later. He also gave her a full account of all that had taken place, and detailed the story of the Major as to her birth, mentioning also the income which Mavis intended to hand over, as soon as the mystery of the crime was solved. When Todd posted this letter he took his way to Denley to see if he could find Geary and arrange for him to appear at the Pixies' house. It was necessary, as Gerald had explained, that all the actors in this drama should come together for the clearing up all perplexities. But Geary was not easy to be found. Afraid of the official warning uttered by Morgan, he had taken to the hills, and although Todd roamed all over the place he could not find the man. He returned to the Prince's Head quite fatigued, and found a telegram from Gerald stating that he and his bride would be in Silbury by the midday train next day. McAndrew communicated the joyful news to Arnold, who had come back from a round of bookselling, for the gnome did not neglect his business even in these anxious days, and the two had a merry little dinner on that same night, prepared by Mrs. Jennings' own hands. And the landlady's cooking, when she desired, was something to be wondered at. Todd insisted on a bottle of champagne being sent for, and the tutor and the lawyer drank long life and happiness to the bride and bridegroom with all honors. "Although," said Todd, setting down his glass, "we are not yet out of the wood." An hour after dinner, and while Arnold was detailing his early connection with Mavis, Mrs. Jennings came in much flustered. "Oh, sir," she said, "here's that horrid black landlord of the Devon maid. He asks to see you, sir. I wouldn't if I were you. He's always drunk, and may be dangerous." "Never mind, I am not afraid. Show him up," said Todd valiantly. Mrs. Jennings shook her head, but did as she was bidden, and in a few minutes Mr. Adonis Geary, looking a wreck of his former stalwart self, came into the room. However, he was perfectly sober, and very much depressed. Wanderings on the hills did not agree with him, and he looked as one of his ancestors might have looked when Cuban bloodhounds were hunting flesh and blood in the days of slavery. "You wish to see me, sah?" said Geary, after a casual glance at Arnold. "Yes, Mr. Geary," replied Todd, settling himself in his chair. "The fact is that things are coming to a climax, and I want you to come to the Pixies' house to morrow afternoon, say at 2:00, to state what you know of Belaria's murder." "I don't know notting, sah," said the negro doggedly. "Mr. Haskins believes that you know everything," retorted Todd sharply, "and unless you want to get into trouble it will be best for you to speak out." "I don't know notting," said Geary again, and rolled his eyes ferociously at the mention of Gerald's name, "and there's notting can hurt me. I hab sold the hotel, and next week I go to Jamaica." "As a pensioner of Major Reb's, I suppose?" "Dat's my business, sah. Dis place no place for me when my wife go away wid my chillun. Valeria dead, dat mad gal dead, and—" "You are wrong in thinking that Miss Durham is dead, Mr. Geary," said Todd, exploding his bombshell according to Jerrold's written instruction. "She is very much alive." Geary staggered and turned his usual green. "She alive?" "Yes, and married to Mr. Jerrold Haskins. You can tell the Major that if you like, Mr. Geary, and tell him also that we are all coming over to morrow to demand the $6,000 a year which Major Reb has held for so long. I fear that your Jamaican pension is not very safe." Geary stood dumbfounded, clutching his breast. His dull brain could scarcely grasp the significance of this speech. But he did grasp the fact that Reb was losing the money and that he, Mr. Adonis Geary, would not benefit. "I tell the Major," he faltered, wheeling. "By all means," said Todd easily. "I sent for you to be my messenger. Come, Geary, as Reb loses the money you had better come on our side and tell us who murdered Valeria." The negro turned at the door and drew himself up. "No, sah," he declared with something of majesty. "I eat the Major's bread, and I no betray the Major." After which speech he went out abruptly. "Does that mean Reb is guilty?" Todd asked Arnold. "I always said that he was," rejoined the ex-tutor dryly, and later the two retired to their several couches to ponder over the new problem. The bride and bridegroom duly arrived the next day. Todd was slightly uneasy, since Geary had probably told the Major, and that gentleman would undoubtedly, for his own safety, take steps to have Mrs. Haskins arrested. However, Geary had probably not delivered the message that Mavis was alive, for no officer of the law appeared to break the joy of the meeting. Mavis looked slightly pale, but her courage was high, and she evidently determined to go bravely through the ordeal. United to her adored Prince Jerrold, she was ready to face anyone and anything by his side. After greetings and explanations and a hurried meal, the whole party drove over to Leagarth in a landau for the momentous meeting. As the carriage passed through the village, Mavis kept her veil down, so she was not recognized. The gates of the Pixies' house, marvelous to relate, were open, and the carriage drew up to the house. Major Reb, with two ladies, was on the terrace. Mavis alighted and raised her veil. "Great heavens!" cried Reb, pale with terror. "Mavis Durham!" "Mrs. Jerrold Haskins," she replied proudly. "And I come for my money." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Sealed Message by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 25. Geary's accusation. It would be hard to say who was the palest and most terror-stricken of the trio who stood on the terrace. Mrs. Crosby clung to her stern mother with dilated eyes, shaking like a reed. But Mrs. Birch, although stern and unmoved, outwardly at least, was also pallid. As for Reb, he leaned against the balustrade of the terrace, scarcely able to speak. Before him stood Todd and Arnold, Jerrold Haskins, and the girl whom he had treated so cruelly, the girl whom he had believed until now was at the bottom of some rural stream. The hour of retribution had come, and in a flash the guilty man saw everything he possessed reft from him, saw also the structure of crime and falsehood he had reared crumbled into dust. His worst enemy would have pitied the Major in that hour of agony. "You!" he faltered, staring at Mavis as though she were indeed the ghost he almost believed her to be. "You!" "Ah!" murmured McAndrew complacently. "So Geary did not deliver my message to you after all?" "Geary?" The Major stood erect, braced for the coming struggle, and his face hardened. "Did Geary know this?" And he pointed to Mavis. "I told him the truth last night." "And he never told me. He never warned me." Reb clenched his fists. "Oh, the scoundrel! I might have. But there, it is too late. Too late." "What do you mean by too late?" said Mrs. Birch imperiously, and throwing a protecting arm round her daughter. "Fight for Madge, if you will not for yourself." But Reb paid no attention to her. "Geary, Geary," he muttered, looking round with bloodshot eyes. "He was in the courtyard an hour ago, and he did not tell me, curse him! He may be Geary! Geary!" He raised his voice to an angry cry, and ran swiftly along the terrace, through the arch, and into the quadrangle. Gerald took the hand of his wife and followed quickly, with Todd and the ex-tutor behind. They did not wish to lose sight of Reb. For one moment Mrs. Birch and her daughter looked at one another, and Madge hung back, trembling. But the mother suddenly seized the widow's wrist and dragged her, a miserable figure, pale-faced and shaking in her gay attire, into the quadrangle. "We must see what Michael will do," whispered Mrs. Birch, passing her tongue over her dry lips. "He may win the day yet." "No, no," moaned Mrs. Crosby. "He is lost." At the far end of the quadrangle Gerald and Mavis saw the token of Geary's drunken handiwork. A considerable portion of the ivy-clothed wall had fallen outward, and lay in ruins on the lip of the cliff. 3 or 4 trees had been dashed into the pool below, and there was a clear view across the ruddle to the green forest beyond. The mystery of the enchanted castle was at an end, and no longer a palace of the Sleeping Beauty, it lay open to the world, as Morgan had said. And now in its romantic quadrangle there were sterner doings than the moonlight wooings of lovers who had, for the moment, recalled the golden age when the gods came down to men. "Geary! Geary!" shouted Reb, rushing towards the fallen wall, and mounting its ruins. There was no response, and Gerald fancied that Reb had merely made an excuse so as to get near the river and throw himself in. But, guilty or innocent, the Major was sufficiently brave to face the sins he had committed, and came down again slowly to the group near the battered sundial. He was still livid, but more self-controlled. "I shall deal with Geary later," he said thickly. "In the meanwhile I can deal with you." "We are quite ready," said Gerald tranquilly. "Who are we?" questioned Reb scathingly. "Myself and my wife." "She is not your wife. A marriage with a madwoman is not legal." Mavis shuddered, and clung to Gerald's arm. It was the first time that she had been called mad to her face. "Oh, guardian," she wailed, "how can you say that of me, when I was so fond of you?" "You had every reason to be fond of me," said Reb harshly, and his eyes gleamed as he thought the girl was weakening. "I gave you a happy home in this delightful place because your brain was not strong enough to bear the troubles of this world." Mavis withdrew her hand from Gerald's arm, and looked scornfully at the liar, whom she now saw in his true colors. "You kept me here that you might enjoy the money which my father left to me," she declared in haughty tones. "You betrayed the trust your dead friend placed in you. I was a weak girl, and an ignorant one, to believe in your lies. But now," she added, stepping forward a pace, "now, Major Reb," and her use of the name showed the attitude she intended to adopt, "I call upon you to give me back my money and leave this place, which belongs to me." "No mad woman can possess money," said Mrs. Crosby shrilly. She saw the Major's income was about to be lost, and that it would be useless to marry him. "Michael, call the police and have her removed." "One moment," said Gerald quietly. "You go too fast, Mrs. Crosby. But I am glad to see you at last as you really are. I thought you were my friend. I now see that you are my enemy. My wife is perfectly sane, and as her husband I shall see that her sanity is proved." "Call the police! Call the police!" cried Mrs. Crosby furiously, and she broke from her mother's grip. "How dare you stand there and insult me, Gerald? I was your friend, and I will be your friend still, if you will shut up that girl and apologize." Todd laughed at the weakness of this speech. "If you cannot find anything better to say, Mrs. Crosby, you had better hold your tongue," he said caustically. "Even if Mrs. Haskins is shut up, the money still belongs to her husband. Major Reb has lost that forever. It is the money you are after, madam." "Yes, it is. Yes, it is," said Mrs. Crosby, utterly reckless, and defying the efforts of her mother to keep her silent. "If you knew the miserable years of poverty I have had, you would not wonder at my wishing for the money. My marriage with Michael will save me from shame and misery, and She choked with mingled terror and rage, and Mrs. Birch pulled her back roughly. "Are you a fool to talk like this?" she muttered. "Hold your tongue, you silly child." She shook her angrily. "Wait until Michael settles this affair. Major Rebb," she turned inquiringly to her proposed son-in-law. "I shall settle this affair very speedily," said Rebb, walking across the lawn towards the archway. "My man shall go for the police. Or, better still, that coachman who drove you from Silbury, Mavis, shall go back to bring Inspector Morgan. I am very sorry that you have thrust yourself into danger, but I should not be doing my duty by society if I did not have you imprisoned." "As a lunatic?" asked Mavis scornfully. She had quite lost her old dread of the Major by this time. "As a murderess," he retorted. "Prove that," said Haskins, stepping in Rebb's path. "Out of my way," growled Rebb, looking dangerous. "You have brought a serious accusation against my wife," persisted the young man, "and I intend to make you prove it. On what grounds do you say that my wife is crazy?" "She has been all her life," said the Major, forced to answer, for he saw very plainly that Haskins would knock him down if he attempted to pass the archway. Not that the Major feared a fight, but his situation was so desperate that he wished to adjust things as quietly as possible. His threat to call the police was a bluff, as Gerald knew, and because Gerald did know, Rebb was furious. "Prove that she has been mad all her life," said Haskins, coolly. "Mavis has been with Mrs. Pallamodin since she left here, and that very clever old woman cannot see that my wife is mad. Nor can McAndrew, nor Arnold, nor anyone else." "I can! I can!" cried Mrs. Crosby, with a bright red spot burning on either cheek and looking very angry. "Ah, you are a prejudiced witness, seeing that you wish to marry Major Rebb for the income he is now losing." "That he has lost," interposed Todd, in a dry legal tone. "The conditions of Julian Durham's will have been fulfilled, and Mrs. Haskins now takes possession of her property." "How can you prove that my wife is mad?" asked Gerald again, and taking no notice of the interruption. "Have you had her examined by 2 doctors according to law?" "No," replied Rebb, grudgingly. "Then how dare you shut her up in this house? I shall bring an action against you on behalf of my wife for false imprisonment." "You had better think twice before you do that," said the Major in icy tones, "for I shall retort with an accusation of murder." "You say that my wife murdered Bellaria?" "I do," said Rebb, doggedly. "I swear to it." "I dare say. But you have yet to prove your accusation. I am quite willing to allow Mavis to be arrested." Gerald stepped aside. "Go and fetch the police, Rebb. They will be here soon." "Here?" Rebb started and turned a shade paler. "I left instructions at the police station before coming here that Inspector Morgan was to come with 2 men. When they arrive you can give Mavis in charge, and then we can submit your accusation of insanity to a couple of doctors, and your charge of murder to a jury." "Then," cried Mrs. Crosby, viciously, "Michael will get back his money." "I think not," replied Gerald, coldly. "I take charge of that." By this time the courage was oozing out of Rebb, who had not expected the young man to take up such an attitude. "Cannot we arrange this matter quietly?" he asked, trying to appear composed. "No," said the other, quietly. "The offer you made me in yonder room does not suit me." "An offer?" said Mrs. Birch in her deep voice. "I offered to let Haskins marry Mavis and take her to America if he, or rather she, surrendered half the income." "I refuse, as Gerald refused," said Mavis, proudly. "I prefer to stand my trial. I am not going to pass the rest of my life under a cloud for your sake, Major Rebb." "Your sister, your twin sister, shall get the money," cried Rebb, at his wits' end how to deal with the situation. "Ah, you never knew that?" "I knew when Gerald told me," said Mrs. Haskins, composedly, "and I more than suspected it before. Indeed, Charity allowed me to pass as herself, so as to save me from you. I shall repay that with 3,000 a year. My husband and I have arranged that." "You passed as Charity?" cried Rebb, amazed. "Yes. I danced at the Belver Theatre, and—" "It's a lie! You couldn't. What became of Charity if you did that?" "Charity was with me," said Todd, stepping forward. "With you?" "Yes, as my wife." Major Reb jumped and staggered against the sundial. "So both the sisters are married," he muttered. "They are," said Todd, "and they have agreed to share the income you have held all these years. I am afraid that the game is up, Major." Reb said nothing. The game was indeed up, and he did not know which way to turn, or how to get the better of his pitiless opponents. Mrs. Birch left her daughter for the moment and touched his arm. "Why did you not tell me that there was another girl?" she asked hoarsely and savagely. "There was no need." And the Major shook her off. "There was every need. You told me, you told Madge, that your income depended upon Mavis Durham." "Mavis Haskins, if you please," interpolated that young lady. Mrs. Birch paid no attention. "On Mavis Durham not marrying. You said that if in some way her insanity could be proved and she could be stopped from marriage that your income would be safe. For that reason my daughter wished to marry you." "She loved me," said Reb unsteadily, and looked at Mrs. Crosby. "I loved you as well as any other man," she said coolly and shrugging her shoulders, "but I would have married anyone to escape from debt and duns and hideous poverty. As you are now poor, of course I cannot marry you. Come, mother, there is nothing more to be got here. Let us go back to our misery." Reb said nothing, but turned very white. The woman for whom he had sold his soul was ready to cast him aside like an old glove. Mrs. Crosby, with a vicious glance at Mavis and a look of indifference at the man she had professed to love, took her mother's arm. Mrs. Birch was quite ready to go, and indeed seemed to be in a hurry to depart. But the path of the two was blocked by the tiny figure of Arnold, who had hitherto held his peace. "So you did know that the Major's income depended upon Mavis being prevented, even by the murder of Valeria, from marrying?" "What is that to you? Let me pass," cried Mrs. Crosby haughtily. "We," Arnold waved his hand to include Gerald and Todd, "we thought that you were ignorant, and so could not guess what was your motive for murdering that unfortunate woman." "Murder?" Mrs. Crosby went a dead white, and became as rigid as a corpse. Reb started and came forward. "You must be mistaken," he said in shaking tones to Arnold. "He is a foul liar," said Mrs. Birch, grasping her daughter to keep her from falling. "Let us pass, sir." "No," said Arnold, still holding his ground, and speaking loudly while the others kept silence. "When Inspector Morgan comes you shall be arrested. I shall give you in charge for this murder, of which Mrs. Haskins is wrongfully accused." Mrs. Crosby shrieked, looking a pitiable spectacle of fear and shame as she clung to her mother. But that stern lady, although white and also terrified, controlled her feelings with iron nerve. "On what grounds do you accuse my daughter?" she demanded. "I saw you and her in a motor car at Beldown. I saw you on the way here. You were at the gates of the Pixies' house shortly before 12 o'clock, waiting for Valeria, whom you lured to the gate by means of a letter." "I was at Bognor. I was at Bognor," cried Mrs. Crosby, shaking with fear. "No," interposed Todd. "My clerk went to watch you at Bognor. Neither you nor Mrs. Birch went there at all. You were down here. Come, Mrs. Crosby, you may as well confess. We can prove all about the motor car, and your presence here." "Madge! Madge!" cried Reb, who looked horrified. "Is this true?" But Mrs. Crosby only clung sobbing to her mother, being terrified almost to death. At the same moment that Reb spoke, Inspector Morgan, with a couple of policemen, entered the quadrangle and advanced towards the group. "You wanted me here, Mr. Haskins?" he asked inquiringly. "I got your message, and here I am with my men. What is it?" "In the first place," said Gerald quietly, "allow me to present to you my wife." Then when Morgan saluted in a puzzled way, he continued, "Once known as Mavis Durham." "What?" Morgan grew red, and his eyes almost started out of his head. "Do you mean to say that this lady is Mavis Durham?" "Mavis Haskins now," said the girl, with a perfectly calm smile, "and I surrender myself to you willingly." "I arrest you in the king's name for murder," gabbled Morgan, trying to recover his official dignity. "Anything you say now will be used in evidence against you." And he signed to his subordinates, likewise startled out of their wits, to take charge of the girl. Arnold sprang forward as a young constable placed his hand on Mavis's arm. "Stop!" he cried. "Mrs. Haskins is innocent. Here is the guilty woman." And he pointed to Mrs. Crosby. "No, no! You can't prove that! You dare not! You " "I can prove it!" cried Arnold, bluffing. "Mrs. Crosby was at the gate of the Pixies' house at the time Valeria Dundee was murdered. A dozen witnesses can swear that she was in the neighborhood." "Is this true?" Morgan asked the little widow, whose gaiety was all gone, and who suddenly looked twice her age. "It is not true! It is not true!" she cried. "Mother and I were at Beldown. We went on to see Major Rebb at Denley." "Hush, you fool!" muttered Mrs. Birch, shaking her. "You never came near me there," cried Rebb, and then became aware that, on the impulse of the moment, he had ruined the widow. In a paroxysm of shame and terror, for the man did love the miserable woman, he added: "Mrs. Crosby is innocent. I swear she is. I know who is guilty." "You?" everyone cried out, Inspector Morgan loudest of all. The scene was beyond his comprehension, and he was on the verge of an apoplectic fit. The whole scene was melodramatic and unreal, and on the stage or when written in a book would have been described so by critics. "Who is guilty?" demanded Morgan, fiercely. "Geary, Adonis Geary," said Rebb. "The knife was his, and I found him in the grounds when I arrived." There was a savage shout before he could finish, and Geary sprang from behind the ruined river wall. He had been concealed there, and had heard everything; but he did not appear until his adored master accused him of the crime. Then terror and rage made him leap forward, half mad and half drunk. "You say one big lie, sah," he shouted, with rolling eyes and a thick voice. "I loved you once, but now you would kill me with a lie. I tell you who did kill that poor Valeria." "Who killed her?" asked Gerald, for Morgan was too bewildered to ask. Geary looked slowly round, and pointed to Mrs. Birch. "Oh, mother, mother!" cried Mrs. Crosby. "I would have saved you if I could." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Sealed Message by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 26. The Gods Are Just. There was an absolute silence for a few moments. What with one accusation and another, Inspector Morgan's brain was reeling. Gerald could only stare in blank amazement at the negro, who declared so positively that Mrs. Birch was guilty of a cowardly murder. As for the accused woman, she put aside her weeping daughter gently and faced the police boldly. Todd and Rebb and Arnold were silent out of sheer astonishment. Haskins had thought Geary guilty; Arnold had believed Rebb to be the doer of the deed; Todd deemed that Mrs. Crosby had struck the blow; but not one of the three ever fancied that Mrs. Birch was the mysterious assassin of the unfortunate Italian. "Ask this man," said Mrs. Birch harshly to Morgan, and pointing towards Geary. "Ask him on what grounds he makes such an accusation. My daughter and I certainly were at Beldown, and drove on past Leagarth, intending to call on Major Rebb at the Devon Maid. But our car broke down, and we were obliged to stop in a cottage for the night. I can prove an alibi." "If you can," said Morgan, finding his tongue, "why should your daughter say that she would have saved you if she could?" "My daughter is mad with terror," said Mrs. Birch, stonily. "Madge knows that I am wholly innocent." And she looked at Mrs. Crosby. "Yes, yes, yes," whispered the widow, faintly. "We stopped the night in a cottage. We are innocent. My mother can prove an alibi." "Dat one big lie!" cried Geary, with scorn. "You would like the major to say dat I killed Valeria? Oh, yes, and I would be hanged, sah." He turned reproachfully towards his master, who had been willing to sacrifice him for another after his years of faithful service. "You are very wicked, massa. I lub you. I do all bad tings for you, but I no die. Dis woman," he pointed to the perfectly calm Mrs. Birch, who was much the most composed of the group, "she come here and kill Valeria.
She write a letter sayin' that if Valeria come to the gate late, she would be safe from dose who would kill her. And Valeria she comes, wid my big knife to save herself. Then this woman," he pointed again at Mrs. Birch, "she stab and stab and stab." "It is all utterly false," denied the accused woman coldly. "Do you believe this of your mother's friend, Gerald?" "No," said the young man generously. "There must be some mistake. I cannot believe that Mrs. Birch would be so wicked. Her known character contradicts this man's accusation. I believed that Geary murdered Valeria himself, at Major Reb's instigation." "That's a lie," said Reb, in an agitated voice. "Dat one big lie," repeated Geary in his own vernacular, and fumbled in his breast pocket. "See, massa," he went towards Morgan, "dis de letter dat I find in Valeria's dress, and—" Mrs. Crosby made a bound and a grab; but Morgan whisked the letter out of Geary's hand and held it above her head. One of the policemen caught the widow to hold her back, and she burst into tears. "Is this your writing, madam?" Morgan asked Mrs. Birch, holding the letter before her. "No," said Mrs. Birch, in an unshaken voice. "Mr. Haskins knows my writing well. Gerald, look at the letter." The young man took the epistle. It was evidently disguised handwriting, clumsy and illiterate. He could not reasonably say that Mrs. Birch had penned the few lines which asked Valeria to come to the gates of the Pixies' house at midnight on a certain date to meet a well wisher, so the letter was signed, who could save her from the Tana Society. The script was quite unlike Mrs. Birch's sloping Italian hand, which was that of the mid Victorian epoch. "No," he said, and very gladly, "I don't think that Mrs. Birch wrote this letter." "Ah!" The woman drew a long breath, but displayed no triumph. "Of course, Mr. Inspector, the charge is absolutely absurd. This mad girl whom Mr. Haskins has married murdered the miserable creature." "Ah," said Gerald, slipping his arm round Mavis, who shivered and hid her face, "you return evil for good, Mrs. Birch." Morgan took the letter and placed it in his pocket. "I don't know what to think," he muttered. "You may be innocent, and Geary—" He glanced at the savage face of the negro, who shouted wrathfully. "I no kill dat woman," he cried, stamping like a wild bull in a rage. "She write de letter. I come to dis house to find de major, and I find Valeria dead. She just dying." "Did she speak?" Mavis asked the question. "No, she no speak. She die at once. I look in de dress, and I find dat letter and dis." Geary opened his huge black palm, and on it lay the coral hand with the dagger. "Dat on de ground near de dress," he ended. "Do you recognize this?" asked Morgan, turning to Gerald, while Mrs. Crosby uttered a wail of fear, and Mrs. Birch became even paler than she had been. Gerald had defended Mrs. Birch before, and she had returned his kindness by accusing Mavis. He determined to leave her to her fate, since she was so ungrateful, especially as he readily recognized the coral hand. "So you did not give it back to Venosta after all," he said to the terrified Mrs. Crosby. "Mr. Inspector, this amulet belongs to—" He was about to say the name when Mrs. Birch, after a glance of despair around, interrupted. "It belongs to me," she said harshly. "Not to my daughter. Mrs. Crosby received it from Signor Venosta, but she gave it to me to return to him after she made use of it to control the Jew money lender. I did not return it to Signor Venosta. She stopped. "It was found near the corpse of Valeria by this man," said Morgan gravely. "So if it belonged to you—" "It hers! It hers!" shouted Geary. "How do you know?" asked Reb, sharply. "I see dis woman in dat engine," he meant the motor car, "on de hill when I leave Valeria dead. I run out to see where anyone was dat kill Valeria, and I see dat woman wid dis udder in dat engine." "But you came running from the house," cried Reb. "You could not." "Let be," said Mrs. Birch, evidently recognizing that denial was useless. "No doubt he did see me. But I am guilty, and Mrs. Crosby is perfectly innocent." "Then you killed the woman?" cried Gerald, appalled. "Yes, but not intentionally. Listen. From you we learned something about this girl, and then my daughter and I were here on one occasion and knew something beforehand about the matter. We forced Major Rebb to explain, as the girl was supposed to be pretty. She cast a disdainful glance at Mavis. And my daughter was a trifle jealous. When you, Gerald, came asking Madge to take charge of this girl I took alarm, as I thought that something serious was the matter." "You did," said Rebb, bitterly, "and you forced me to tell you the truth of how my income depended upon Mavis never getting married. But I did not expect you to kill Valeria so as to save the income." "I did not do so for that purpose," said Mrs. Birch, steadily. "Madge and I were in despair, as only her marriage with you could save us from terrible trouble. When Gerald explained about Valeria's fear of the coral hand, I learned its purport from Signor Venosta. Then I thought that I could use it to bend Valeria to my will." "What was your will?" asked Todd, who looked awestruck. "To insist that Valeria should take Mavis to Italy, and keep her there so as to prevent her marrying. Then I knew that Major Rebb's income would be safe, and that Madge could marry, and take us both out of the horrible misery we endured trying to keep up appearances on nothing." "On nothing?" cried Haskins, suddenly. "Beyond 100 a year Madge and I were penniless," said Mrs. Birch, coolly. "But you lived in style," said Rebb, who seemed to be thunderstruck by these sordid revelations. "Oh, we are only a couple of adventuresses," said Mrs. Birch, ironically. "We deceived everyone, even Gerald's mother, who was as kind and good a woman as ever breathed." "Don't," muttered the young man, softly. "I am only praising the dead," said Mrs. Birch, stolidly. "I say no evil of her. Well, then, we were in desperate straits, else I never would have hit on the desperate scheme of getting Valeria to kidnap Mavis, which was what it amounted to. I told Madge nothing, save that I wanted to see Major Rebb. We informed Gerald that we were going to Bognor, and we really were going. But by my plan we came to Devonshire, and Madge got one of her friends to lend her a motor. She drives excellently, and as we were at Beldown before, she knows the country. I pretended that Major Rebb was at the Pixies' house and had arranged to see me at midnight. This I told my daughter." "And you believed so ridiculous a story?" said Morgan, fixing an official eye on the shrinking woman. But she only moaned. "Leave her alone. I am to blame," said Mrs. Birch, sharply. "And the murder of Valeria was pure accident." "Pure accident?" muttered Arnold, ironically. Mrs. Birch turned on him with a wintry smile. "Yes, sir. The car broke down. That was really an accident. While Madge was seeing what was the matter I said that I would walk on, and inquire if Major Rebb was at the house, and could take us in for the night. I came to the gates and waited for a time. Valeria came at length. She opened the gates in fear and trembling, and was armed with a large yellow-handled knife. "Dat my knife," muttered the negro, and rolled his eyes. I explained who I was, and told her about the marriage. I said that I could put Venosta, as representing the society, on her track, unless she took Mavis to Italy and kept her single. I promised her a pension, but the foolish creature," Mrs. Birch shrugged her shoulders, "would listen to nothing. She refused to go to Italy, saying that she would be killed there. I showed her the coral hand, and she tried to snatch it from me. We struggled, and she lost her head, saying that I had come to kill her. Once she wounded me in the arm." Here Mrs. Birch rolled up her sleeve and showed a newly healed scar of considerable dimensions. "So I tried to take the knife from her. Then—" "Then?" cried Morgan, speaking for the others, who were all tongue-tied and staring at the terrible recital. Mrs. Birch put a slim hand to her head. "I don't know exactly what took place," she said wearily and indifferently, "but somehow I got the knife, and in the struggle, in the darkness, I stabbed her to the heart. When she fell I was terrified at what I had done, and flung the knife into the long grass. The coral hand had long since fallen to the ground. Then I ran away back to the car. I found Madge had repaired the damage, which was slight. She saw blood on my dress. I told a lie and we got into the car to fly. On the hill yonder," she pointed over the ruined wall towards Denley, "the car went wrong again. Then it was that we saw a man come running up. It was Geary, but Madge started the car and we managed to get away. I was not sure if he recognized us." You," said Geary with a grin. "In the lamp. I saw you when I come to town wid my massa. But I say noting till my massa want to hang me. I come back and look for dis gal in the house."
"I had fled by that time with Arnold," said Mavis faintly. "Is that all?" asked Morgan formally, turning to Mrs. Birch. "What else would you have?" she asked. "Did your daughter know of—" "She knew nothing." "I only knew that my mother had accidentally killed Valeria," cried Mrs. Crosby foolishly. "I made her tell me because of the blood." "You idiot!" said the mother between her teeth. "Then," said Morgan officially, "I must arrest you both." "But I am innocent!" shrieked Mrs. Crosby. "You are an accomplice after the fact," said Morgan. "Come." He laid a heavy hand on Mrs. Crosby's shoulder. She started away with a terrible cry. Reb flung himself forward to save her. Morgan grappled with him, and Mrs. Birch tried to snatch her daughter out of the way. The others were too startled to move. Mrs. Crosby, who was mad with fear, tore herself from the grasp of Mrs. Birch and ran towards the ruined wall, in the vain hope of escaping. "Save me! Help me! I won't go to prison! I am innocent! Innocent!" In deadly terror she scrambled over the fallen wall. Geary ran forward to stop her from escaping, while Morgan still fought with the Major, and the two policemen were trying to help their superior. On seeing the negro run after Mrs. Crosby, the mother, silent and savage, moved swiftly across the grass in pursuit. She did not run, but she glided so rapidly that in a moment, as it seemed, she was over the ruins of the wall, and on the verge of the cliff along with Madge. The negro she pushed aside. As the others came running up, she cried out, "Madge, let us die together!" And before Mrs. Crosby knew what was in her mother's mind she had leaped into the deep pool, holding her dearly loved daughter, for whom she had sinned so deeply. There was a loud splash, the agonized scream of Mrs. Crosby, and then silence. 6 months later a happy young couple were in the drawing room of a handsome house in Kensington. With them was Mrs. Pallamodin, looking more stately and graceful than ever. She had established herself on the sofa in her regulation attitude, and Mavis was seated in a low chair beside her. Gerald stood with his back to the fire, smoking, and looked extremely happy. His happiness was reflected in the face of his young wife, and Mrs. Pallamodin presided over the joint enjoyment like a fairy godmother. "You are both looking splendid," she said in her deep, clear voice. "And I am glad to see you both after your sojourn abroad. But do you think it was kind to leave England without seeing me?" Mavis caught the two hands of the old actress. "No, it was not kind. I said that it was not kind. But Gerald—" "Gerald said that it was necessary," said that young man coolly. "Dear Mrs. Pallamodin, look at the circumstances. There was the inquest on the bodies of those two poor women, who drowned themselves in the Peace Pool, in Mother Carey's Peace Pool. I thought that Mrs. Birch dragged her daughter to death." "So she did," admitted Gerald quickly. "Mrs. Crosby would have been arrested as an accomplice after the fact, and in any case would have sunk into poverty without her mother to help her. Mrs. Birch of course thought she would be hanged, although, seeing how she swore that the crime was accidental, extenuating circumstances might have been found. I suppose Mrs. Birch, who was frantically fond of her daughter, thought it best they should go together. Madge certainly would have lived, poor soul, in spite of all her misery, as she loved life. But Mrs. Birch pulled her down, and they are buried in Leagarth Cemetery." "Beside Valeria," said Mavis with a shiver. "How strange!" "The punishment of Providence, my dear," said Mrs. Pallamodin rebukingly. "The murderess was laid beside her victim. A wicked woman—" "No," said Gerald, throwing up his hand. "Don't call her that." "But she murdered. I believe that the crime really was committed accidentally. And as she and poor Madge have paid for their sins, let us leave them to God, Mrs. Pelham Oden. Who are we to judge, and as was revealed at the inquest, those two women had suffered much misery and trouble." "I wonder how they managed to deceive the tradesmen for so long," said the old actress musingly. "I am sure my tradesmen always make me pay every month. But look at the thousands they owed, and it would all have been paid had Mrs. Crosby married the Major. I dare say, with Mavis's $6,000 a year." "I have only $3,000," said Mrs. Haskins. "Charity has the rest." Mrs. Pelham Oden kissed the girl's forehead. "You behaved in a noble way, my dear. I hear that Lady Euphemia has quite taken to Charity, now that she knows her father was a Devonshire Durham. And Todd has got back his ruined castle to play the laird. He says, however, that he is coming back from Scotland to work again at the law." "And quite right he is," said Gerald, sitting down. "I don't believe in any man being lazy. Lady Euphemia wants Todd to play the laird on his wife's money, but Todd has too much respect to live on his wife." "I know you have," said Mavis, looking at him fondly. "You don't know how difficult it is to make him take money," she added, turning to the actress. "He will live on his own income, and works like a nigger." "Not like Geary, if he is the nigger in question. My dear Mavis, this house is yours, and I—" "You're going to say that you are a boarder. Stop." And Mavis laid a pretty hand over his mouth. Gerald kissed it. "You are both extremely silly," said Mrs. Pelham Oden. "Share and share alike. Money and love and sentiments and everything." "Right," said Haskins, playfully. "Mavis, darling, give me back that kiss." "I came here," said Mrs. Pelham Oden in her most dignified way, "to welcome you back from the Continent, so I must be attended to, and you did leave England after the trial without seeing me." Gerald rose and became serious. "I did so to save my wife from an attack of brain fever," he said gravely. "Think of what that trial meant to a girl who had never faced such a throng of people."
"Oh, Gerald, there was the Belver Theatre."
"I am sure the people in the court were a better audience," said Mrs. Pelham Oden, using her fan. "And after all, the trial was a mere form. You were proved to be quite sane by those two nice doctors, and perfectly innocent, when the evidence was given as to Mrs. Birch's verbal confession. I read all about it in the papers. You were made quite a heroine, Mavis, and as I like heroines, I expected you to come and tell me all about it. Instead of which," added the actress, returning to her grievance, "you went quietly to the Continent." "To Switzerland," said Haskins, slipping his arm around Mavis's waist. "There we passed a happy time, and Mavis recovered from the shock of all these dreadful things. We never talk of them now." "I am very sorry to," said Mrs. Pelham Oden obstinately, "but I must know what has become of everyone. Major Rebb, I understand, is in South America?" "Yes, he could not face the court, and so he bolted. No one went after him, as of course he knew nothing about the murder, and Mavis did not prosecute him for his behaviour to her." "Geary, that terrible Uncle Tom's Cabin person?" "He ran away also. I expect he is with Rebb now. I must say Rebb did not treat him well, trying to fix the guilt on him. Perhaps he's given Rebb the go by on that account, and is now in Jamaica with another wife." "Where is the English one?" "In Barnstaple, with her coffee-colored children. Mavis allows her a small income."
"I am so sorry for her," said Mrs. Haskins, apologetically. "I am sorry for anyone who is unhappily married."
"Well, you and Charity have married good men." "But poor men," said Gerald, smiling. End of chapter 26. End of The Sealed Message by Fergus Hume. Recorded by Celine Major.